He bought the record alone. That was how Seth Joplin did most things that mattered to him, quietly, without announcement, without making the doing of the thing into an occasion that required other people to witness it. He drove to the record store in Beaumont because Port Arthur's stores didn't always carry what he was looking for, and he found the album on the shelf, and he looked at his daughter's face on the cover for a moment, wild-haired, laughing, the particular expression she wore when she was most completely herself, and he brought it to the counter and paid for it and drove home. This was the summer of 1968. Cheap Thrills had just been released. It would reach #1 on the Billboard charts within weeks, and the name Janis Joplin was beginning to appear in newspapers and magazines in ways that people in Port Arthur read with the complicated mixture of pride and bewilderment that small towns bring to the fame of their most unlikely exports. She had been the girl who didn't fit. Now she was the girl who had left and become something the world was paying attention to, and the town was in the process of revising its relationship to both of those facts. Seth Joplin was not revising anything. He had not needed to. His relationship to his eldest daughter had never been based on the town's assessment of her, because he had been watching her from closer range than the town had access to, and what he had seen from that range was different from what Port Arthur had seen and had always been different. He had seen the intelligence, the intensity, the refusal to be smaller than she was. He had seen in the girl who talked too much and felt too much and read the wrong books and listened to the wrong music. Fused constitutionally and completely to make herself legible to the social machinery of Thomas Jefferson High School, he had seen something that he recognized, perhaps because some portion of it had come from him. He took the record home. He put it on the turntable. He sat down and listened. What he heard was his daughter, not the famous version, not the symbol that the music press was beginning to construct around the voice and the image and the Monterey performance that D. Pennebaker had filmed his daughter, the specific, particular, irreplaceable person who had grown up in his house and left it looking for something she couldn't have named yet, and who had found it, or found a version of it, or found the closest thing to it that the world was going to offer. He listened to the whole album. Then he sat for a while in the room in Port Arthur with the Gulf Coast evening coming through the windows, and then he went and found paper and a pen and he wrote his daughter a letter. When Janis received it, weeks later, forwarded through the channels that mail traveled through to reach someone who was always somewhere different from where they'd been when you last had their address, she read it and cried. Not the crying of someone receiving bad news, the other kind. The kind that comes when someone you needed to hear something from has finally said it, in words exact enough to reach the place where the needing lived. She kept the letter. She spoke about it rarely, and when she did, in the careful way of someone protecting something they do not want reduced by too much handling, but she spoke about it. And what she said in those rare mentions was enough to establish that the letter from her father after he listened to Cheap Thrills alone in Port Arthur was one of the most important things she ever received. This is the story of what was in it, not the words. Those were between Seth Joplin and his daughter, and they belonged to that correspondence, but the life that produced it, the father and the daughter and the 30 years between the beginning and the letter, and what the music had carried between them across a distance that ordinary conversation had never quite been able to close. Seth Ward Joplin was born in 1913 and grew up in a part of America that did not, in the first decades of the 20th century, provide much infrastructure for the kind of mind he had. He was a reader not casually, not as a hobby, but in the serious, ongoing, somewhat compulsive way of someone who experiences books as a primary form of engagement with the world rather than a supplement to other forms. He read philosophy and literature and history. He read Khalil Gibran and Proust. He thought carefully about difficult questions and held his conclusions loosely, which is the habit of mind that distinguishes genuine intellectual engagement from the performance of it. He became an engineer, a practical profession, a stable one, the kind of work that the Gulf Coast economy in the post-war decades reliably required and rewarded. He married Dorothy East, a woman of warmth and practicality, and the specific form of love that expresses itself through attention to the concrete needs of the people in its care. They settled in Port Arthur and built a life there, a modest house, 3 children, the ordinary accumulation of a middle-class Texas family in the 1940s and 1950s. But inside the ordinary accumulation, Seth Joplin continued to be the person he had always been, someone whose mind was elsewhere, in the books, in the questions, in the thinking that had nowhere particular to go in Port Arthur, but that would not stop being what it was because of that. He took his children to the art museum in Beaumont when they were young. He talked to them about what he was reading. He modeled, without exactly intending to model it, the behavior of someone who takes ideas seriously because ideas are serious, and who does not apologize for that seriousness because apology would require finding it shameful. His eldest daughter absorbed this. Absorbed it early and completely, and in the amplified way that she absorbed everything, more intensely than the model, more openly, more visibly, without the containment that Seth had learned to maintain as a survival strategy in an environment that found his intellectual life slightly exotic but ultimately tolerable. Janis had not yet learned containment, and Port Arthur had less tolerance for her version of the same essential quality than it had for her father's, for reasons that had partly to do with gender and partly to do with intensity, and partly to do with the specific way that adolescent social machinery responds to anything that cannot be categorized and therefore cannot be managed. She was his daughter in the way that matters most, not biologically, which was given, but intellectually and temperamentally. The person she was had come in significant measure from the person he was, the restlessness, the refusal to accept the available categories as sufficient, the hunger for something that Port Arthur could not provide and that she would have to leave to find. These qualities were not identical. In father and daughter they expressed themselves in completely different registers, Seth's internal and literary, Janis's external and sonic, but they were related. They came from the same source, he understood this. Whatever Port Arthur understood about Janis Joplin in the years she was growing up there, her father understood something different and something more accurate, that the intensity the town found excessive was not a defect to be corrected but a quality to be developed. That the girl who felt too much was feeling at the right frequency and simply needed a world large enough to receive what she was putting out. He could not give her that world. He could not give her San Francisco or Monterey or the Fillmore or the specific community of people in the Haight who took her in without asking her to be smaller. He was an engineer at Texaco in Port Arthur, a man who read Proust and took his children to museums and thought carefully about difficult things, and the world he could offer his eldest daughter was the world he lived in, which was not the world she needed. What he could give her, what he did give her, though neither of them would have used this language for it, was permission. The specific, early, foundational permission to be what she was. The demonstrated evidence, visible in the man who sat in the living room reading his books and who took her seriously when she talked about what she was thinking, that intensity was not a problem to be solved. That feeling things deeply was not a defect. That the world was larger than Port Arthur and that the people who could not fit in Port Arthur were not wrong, they were just pointed toward somewhere else. This was what he gave her, and this was what the letter, written in the summer of 1968 after he sat alone in Port Arthur and listened to Cheap Thrills from beginning to end, was about. The album that Seth Joplin listened to alone in his Port Arthur house in the summer of 1968 was a document of what his daughter had become in the 2 years since she had arrived, more permanently than before, in San Francisco. It was also a document of what she had always been, concentrated, amplified, given a band and a recording studio and the specific context of a cultural moment that was ready to receive it. Big Brother and the holding company were the vessel, but Janis was the center. Every track on the album demonstrated what the people who had been watching her in the Haight and at the Fillmore and finally at Monterey had been trying to describe. A voice that did not merely sing songs but inhabited them, that found the emotional truth at the center of whatever material it was given and occupied that truth completely, without management and without distance. The voice that Port Arthur had experienced as too much, given finally a context large enough for what it was. Seth Joplin had not been to Monterey. He had not been to the Fillmore. He had been in Port Arthur, reading the newspapers that mentioned his daughter's name in increasingly significant contexts, and worrying in the specific way that parents worry about children who are living lives that the parents cannot fully see or follow. Dorothy worried about the practical things, the touring, the health, the irregular hours, the world that she understood as dangerous in specific and concrete ways. Seth worried about something harder to name. something that had to do with whether the world that was now paying attention to his daughter was paying attention to the right things, whether what she was giving it and what it was giving back were anywhere close to equivalent. He put the needle on the record and he heard, for the first time through speakers rather than through a newspaper or a magazine or the second-hand accounts of people who had been to the shows, what his daughter actually sounded like when she was being what she was. He heard "Piece of My Heart." He heard "Summertime." He heard "Ball and Chain," which was the song that had stopped Cass Elliot in the wings at Monterey with her hand raised toward her mouth. He heard his daughter's voice doing what it had always done, at a scale and with a context that finally matched the scale of the voice itself. And he heard something else, something that was not visible in the reviews or the chart positions or the coverage, that was beginning to accumulate around the name Janis Joplin, something that was only audible to someone who had known the voice before it was famous, who had heard it in the ordinary registers of a daughter in a house in Port Arthur, talking about what she was reading and what she was thinking, and what she needed that the town around her could not provide. He heard that she was still looking for the same thing she had always been looking for. That the voice, for all its power and all its reach and all the thousands of people it had moved at Monterey and in the Fillmore and on the stages that the album's success would now multiply, that the voice was still, underneath everything, the voice of someone who needed to be understood rather than merely heard, who needed the receiving to match the giving in a way that rooms full of strangers, however moved, however genuinely responsive, could not quite provide. He understood this because he had felt it himself, in a smaller register and a different key, the specific loneliness of a mind that is operating in a context not quite calibrated for it. The loneliness of someone who thinks differently from the people around them and has found ways to manage that difference, to contain it, to make it socially functional, to be the quiet engineer who reads Proust and takes his children to museums without ever quite resolving it. His daughter had not contained it. She had given it to the world completely at full volume, through the most powerful vocal instrument that anyone who heard it had ever encountered. And the world had received it with genuine enthusiasm, and the gap was still there. He put down the record and he found paper and a pen and he wrote to her, what a father says to a daughter after listening to her sing, really listening, alone in a room, without the social negotiations that presence requires, is something that exists in the private correspondence between those two people and belongs there. The specific words Seth Joplin wrote to Janis in the summer of 1968 are not public and are not the subject of this accounting. What is the subject is the relationship that made the letter possible. The 30 years of a specific father and a specific daughter, from Port Arthur in the 1940s to the Gulf Coast evening in 1968, when a man sat alone with his eldest daughter's record and understood something about what she had been carrying and what she had done with it. Janis had left Port Arthur looking for something. She had found it, or found the closest available approximation, which in the economy of human longing is sometimes the best you get and is, in the best cases, enough. She had found San Francisco and Big Brother and Monterey and the recognition of a world that had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly the voice she had. She had found stages large enough for what the voice could do, and audiences ready to receive what it gave, and the specific, rare satisfaction of a performer who has found the precise context in which their particular quality becomes not too much but exactly right. And she had not found, in all of that, the specific form of being known that had been missing since Port Arthur, that had been missing, if she was honest with herself, since before Port Arthur, since before she had language for what was missing. The being known by someone who had the full information, who had seen the beginning as well as the middle, who could hold the complete arc. Rather than only the part the world had access to, her father could hold it. He had the beginning. He had been there for the years when the intensity that would later produce the voice was simply a quality in a girl in a Texas town, unhoused and unmagnified, experienced by everyone around her as excessive and experienced by him as something else, something he recognized. Something he had seen in himself, in the quieter and more contained form that his temperament and his circumstances had required. The letter he wrote after listening to the album was the act of holding the arc, of saying, in whatever specific words he found, in the particular language of a man who read Proust and worked as an engineer, and loved his daughter in the specific, imperfect, genuine way that fathers love daughters across distances of geography and generation, and the vast differences. In how two people can experience the same family, that he had heard what she was doing, and he knew what it had come from, and he understood. Janis read it and cried. Of course she cried. She had been giving everything she had to rooms full of strangers for 2 years. She had been pouring the intensity that Port Arthur had experienced as a defect into performances that moved thousands of people who did not know her name before she began to sing, and did not, by the nature of what they were to her, have access to where the intensity had come from. She had been received with genuine enthusiasm by a world that understood her as a phenomenon without quite understanding her as a person. And then a letter arrived from Port Arthur, from the man who had read Proust in the living room and taken her to museums in Beaumont and engaged with her ideas when no one else in her immediate world was interested in engaging with them, and in the letter he said whatever he said, the specific words that are not public, and she understood that someone who had the full information had heard what she was doing and had recognized it for what it was, not what the reviews said it was, not what the symbol makers were in the process of making it. What it actually was, the continuation of something that had begun in a house in Port Arthur, in a family that contained, among its ordinary accumulation of Texas middle-class life, a man who thought differently from the people around him and a daughter who thought differently from everyone, and who had each needed something the town around them could not provide, and who had found their different ways of living with that need, and who had found each other in the letter and the record across the distance that life had placed between them. Seth Joplin outlived his daughter. He was there in October 1970 when the news came from Los Angeles, and he was there in January 1971 when Pearl was released, and he was there in the years after when the legend around his daughter's name grew into something that included and excluded her in equal measure, that captured the voice and the stage and the symbol, and could not quite hold the person, the specific person, who had been the girl in his house before any of it. He did not speak publicly about her in ways that many people have access to. He was a private man by nature and by habit, and the privacy he maintained about his daughter's life and his relationship with her was consistent with the privacy he maintained about his own. He was an engineer who read Proust and took his children to museums and wrote a letter to his daughter after listening to her sing, and that was most of what he left behind in the public record. But Janis spoke about him, rarely and with the specific care of someone protecting something valuable from too much exposure, but she spoke about him. She described the letter. She described what it had meant. She described in the fragmented and indirect way that people describe the most important things, the relationship between what she was doing on stage and what had been present in that living room in Port Arthur, the restlessness, the refusal to accept the available categories, the hunger for something larger than the immediate context could provide. She was his daughter in the way that matters. And the recordings she left behind, the ones that have been playing somewhere in the world every day since they were released, and that still arrive with the same force they carried when they were made, those recordings carry, underneath everything else they carry, the trace of a man who sat alone in a house in Port Arthur in the summer of 1968 and listened to his daughter sing and recognized what he was hearing. He recognized it because some portion of it had come from him, the restlessness, the refusal, the hunger for a world large enough for what you actually are. He gave her that before San Francisco gave it to her, before Monterey gave it to her. Before any of it, in the living room in Port Arthur, in the books on the shelf, in the trips to the museum, in the engagement with her ideas when no one else was engaging with them, in the implicit, foundational, never quite spoken message that intensity is not a defect. It is, if anything, the beginning. Janis Joplin knew that. She had always known it. And when the letter arrived from Port Arthur after he listened to Cheap Thrills alone in the house where she had grown up, she read it and cried because someone who had been there at the beginning had heard what the beginning had become. That is the story that lives underneath the legend, the one that does not appear in the Monterey footage or the chart positions or the critical vocabulary reaching for geological metaphors. The one between a father and a daughter, across the distance that life had placed between them, in a record and a letter, and the specific, private, irreplaceable form of being known.